Congressman, thank you for your turn to the sun. The last time you were here, you were candidate Moulton. Now you're Congressman Moulton. And we're very happy to have you here representing the 6th District.
It's good to be back. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And first of all, just give us a brief overview of what these first 92 days have been like in Washington, the experience, and should we be positive about what is taking place in Washington?
Sure. So I've had two main priorities for my first 100 days in office. The first, the number one, is listening. My job is to be a representative of the people of this district, and I'm not coming in thinking that I have all the ideas or all the solutions. I think the ideas are out there. So I'm listening to people, I'm understanding their concerns, understanding what they're worried about locally, what they're worried about nationally and internationally, and thinking about all the ideas that are coming my way and what we can do. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I am working on building my team. And there's a lot of work to be done there. We are in the fortunate position of having received 1,000 applications for the 18 positions on the staff. So there's a tremendous amount of enthusiasm and excitement, but it takes a lot of work to weed through 1,000 applications, and we're working hard to put together the best team we possibly can, because this office isn't just about me, it's about the team that I put together to serve the people of the district.
Now, hopefully, you don't need any Senate confirmation for those appointments, right? So, that's a joke. But, okay, we're going to go around the room, because everybody has some questions like to ask you. But I'd just like to start off with, in light of today's verdict in the Boston Marathon bombing trials, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev was convicted on all counts. Should he be given a life sentence, or should he face the death penalty?
Well, first of all, let me just say he is a brutal, vicious killer, a criminal, and that was reaffirmed today in court. But I do not believe in the death penalty. I don't believe in it morally. It's clearly been misapplied in the past. There have been mistakes made, and I don't think that it's the morally right thing to do. We're one of very few countries, China and a few others left in the world, that still uses it. But more important, just as importantly, it's also not a good economic investment. And it's been shown through countless studies that we waste more money dealing with death penalty appeals cases, working their way through the legal system, than we do by just putting people and locking them away for life.
But you think that in this particular instance, where it seems particularly clear, with all unanimous decisions on all counts, which were close to 30, I believe, that he should still take get a life sentence? I mean, what does that serve? Does that really serve the people well?
Yes, that's what I believe.
Okay.
Go ahead, it doesn't matter which way.
Go that way.
Okay, Seth, I have a bunch of questions, but in no particular order. When you were here meeting with us prior to the election, one of the first things you said you'd do upon being elected to Congress was file legislation to improve veterans' health care. Now, as my colleague Dave mentioned earlier, certainly there's been improvements. You know, they got rid of the former director, brought in a new guy, they've hired doctors, and they tried to get to the bottom of things. Could you just touch base on what you think has transpired down there, your view on that, and what have you done to fulfill that campaign promise in terms of filing legislation?
Sure, so there has been some progress, and I think you're right that the leadership changes at the VA are moving things in the right direction. We have someone at the helm now who's not only a veteran himself, but has a lot of experience reforming large organizations. He's a former corporate CEO, turned around Procter & Gamble, and that's the kind of leadership that I think we need for such a large organization. But there's an awful lot of work that still needs to be done. I also made a commitment that I would continue getting my health care at the VA, and I have held that up. We have a physician assigned to the House of Representatives, and I think he was a little surprised when I said I was going to continue getting my health care at the VA. He said, well, we've never had that happen before. Well,
rather than him, you mean? Rather than
well, right, in the healthcare system, so through the Congress. But I said, no, I made that commitment, I'm serious about it, and I have used the healthcare system in the VA myself, and I'll tell you that my personal experience has not been entirely positive. There are some things that are okay, there are some things that are pretty bad. It's shown me firsthand that there absolutely is still a lot of work that needs to be done. Now, in the legislative piece, we are working on legislation right now. I'm not going to propose something until I have really worked it through and have some confidence that we can get it passed. So we look forward to releasing that soon, but we haven't done it yet.
Can you tell
As
us
I
what
said,
that is going to touch on?
well, we're looking at veterans health care, and we're also looking at the intersection between veterans health care and the opioid addiction that is just the crisis that is really hitting Massachusetts especially hard. And there are reasons why the veterans who come back from the war and feel like they're not getting the mental health care that they need are particularly susceptible to this opioid crisis. And so we're trying to see if that might be one particular area where we could have an impact, because it's not only an issue for veterans, it's an issue right here at home for people in Massachusetts. But there are a couple of different ideas that we're working on. As I said before, my first 100 days have been really focused on building the team so we have the best team we can to craft legislation like that and make sure it gets passed, and two, listening to people in the district. Certainly, one of the things I've learned in listening over the past 92 days is that the opioid crisis is one of the things that's tops on people's mind here at a local level. And frankly, that's not something that was an issue. I mean, it was starting to be an issue. It was definitely out there during the campaign, but it wasn't something that I was focused on then. It is something that I'm looking at now.
Do you think that the care given to male veterans who are returning is better than what the female soldiers are receiving, or is the VA just not adequately positioned right now to deal with the problems of returning women veterans? Because we've heard from some people, even the prosthetics aren't up to the quality that some of the men are receiving. We've heard this from Nikki Sangis's office and some people in this area. So are they adequately prepared to deal with women's issues, or is this just?
I don't think so, but I don't know specifically whether it's men or women who have the most problems. I mean, the sheer volume of cases is probably with men. But the reality of the VA is that it was built to deal with a different generation of veterans. And so I think this is probably a good example of where, in the same way that the VA 20 years ago didn't deal with traumatic brain injury because people didn't come back with traumatic brain injury because those injuries just were fatal. And now they're surviving those types of injuries, and so we have more mental health care cases. Well, in the same way, 30 years ago, we hardly had any women soldiers, and so we didn't have to provide health care for them. So there are a lot of places at the VA that need reform to meet the needs of this generation of veterans.
Just a quick follow-up. Governor Baker was here a couple of weeks ago. One of our colleagues asked him about, it was Kate, right?
Right.
Who asked him about veterans agents.
Mm-hmm.
And then this speaks directly to your point. The question was that, what can the state do to prepare veterans agents for today's veteran?
Right.
And I'm sure you see this in some of the small towns in the district, right? You have these veterans agents that are, in all due respect to those veterans agents, they're kind of archaic.
Well,
and,
look, not
and
all
are
of
they
them are.
are they properly? No, but listen, are they properly trained to deal with guys, men and women from Afghanistan and from Iraq and other places?
The veterans agent in Gloucester was in my office yesterday, the day before, and he is a Marine veteran from the War on Terror. He is doing a fantastic job. I mean, he works nonstop. He was carrying around a card that he's putting together for the Gloucester Marine who was recently wounded on duty. And he's doing a great job, and he certainly understands the needs of today's veterans. There are older veterans who can get that too if they're really in touch with what's going on, but there's no question, I think, that Massachusetts has a great program in theory where every town has a veterans agent. The reality is that there's not a lot of quality control there. And so some veterans agents work really hard and do a good job. Others really aren't up to snuff. So if I'd be thrilled to hear that the governor is going to work on that.
Yeah. Well, I think you mentioned to an aide to write that down. So, yeah, we'll see.
Just what you have learned in the brief time that you've been down there right now, is the VA bureaucracy, lean, mean, and ready to respond?
Not at all, no. I mean, I think the VA bureaucracy is what's really broken. My personal experience, just to bring it back to that for a minute, when I was at the VA in Boston, I actually had a very talented primary care physician for a long time. He's one of the best primary care physicians I've ever had. And I always felt like I was in good hands being under his care. But he could refer me to someone else to see, and it could take months to get an appointment. Or just shoot me down the hall to get my blood drawn, and I'd wait for hours just to get my blood drawn. So it's really the bureaucracy that I think is the thing that needs to be fixed most about the VA. It's the bureaucracy that hasn't made enough mental health care professionals available. It's the bureaucracy that leads to the long wait times for veterans when they're simply trying to see someone to get care. And you know what, if a veteran comes into the VA or calls the VA and says, I'm thinking about committing suicide, they need to be seen immediately. That's not an appointment that can wait a couple weeks or a couple months. So the VA bureaucracy needs to be much more responsive, and I think that's going to take some significant reform.
Does that come from the director? Does it come from Congress? Where is the leadership that implements that new?
Well, it's a good question, because I think some of it is internal, and that can be fixed by the new secretary of the VA. But I think there are other parts that may need to be fixed by legislation. And I'll give you an example. The claims approval process right now, I mean, you wait for months, sometimes for years, to get your claim approved. Now, why is it that you turn in your taxes and they accept or reject the return in a matter of weeks, and yet if you're a veteran, you can only be trusted by the government, right? Even more than your average person paying taxes. It takes sometimes years to get a claim evaluated. So that's a place where perhaps Congress can step in and adjust the process. That's actually another place where we're looking at potential legislation.
Now, do you still have your own VA healthcare, or you want to?
No, I've got it. I've got my VA healthcare card, and I've been going. Yeah.
Tom, you want to?
Well, let's change gears for a minute. Let's talk about Trans-Pacific Partnership. What do you think about that in general, and what do you see as potential impacts, either in favorable or harmful?
Well, I wrote a letter that was signed by some fellow freshman Democrats about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This is the biggest trade deal that has come before, or will come before Congress to date. And the administration is very strongly behind it and pushing it strongly, because they believe that it will help keep jobs in America. They believe it'll help companies grow and expand by being able to export their goods overseas. But there are a lot of concerns from people that it also may result in jobs leaving America to go to labor markets in Asia. And a lot of labor unions have approached me with those concerns, and frankly, I share those concerns, because this is a historic manufacturing district. I mean, we're sitting in the city of Lowell in a manufacturing building, right? And we don't want to see these jobs, the kind of jobs that were right here 50 years ago, go overseas because of this deal. But I'm going to look at this, as I have promised to do with every piece of legislation that comes before me, and I'm going to evaluate it on its merits. I'm not just going to throw the baby out with the bathwater because some trade deals have been ineffective in the past. I'm also not going to accept it just because people in the business community think it's the right thing to do. I'm going to look at the text of the deal. I'm going to look at the details of the provisions in there that protect jobs here at home. And I'm going to look at the details of how not only are jobs supposed to be protected, but how those regulations will be enforced. Because it's one thing to have regulations on paper, it's another to actually have them enforced to make sure that we don't lose jobs overseas.
How do you feel about fast-tracking legislation? So talk about that.
Well, fast track is it's an often misunderstood term, but the reality is that there's been a long tradition in Congress of putting together trade promotion authority, sometimes called fast track, that allows an up or down vote on trade deals. Now, there's a very practical, straightforward, simple reason why this is the case. It's because you can't negotiate a deal, have everybody else around the world sign it, and then have it amended in Congress, because then you'd have to go back and it'd be this continual process. You'd never get anything approved. So just about every major trade deal that's come before Congress in the past, 50 or 70 years, has had some sort of trade promotion authority associated with it. Now, I have said that I did not think that the previous proposal for fast-track legislation in the last Congress involved sufficient protections, because Congress does have a role here. So I would not have voted for that. But we'll see what type of legislation is put forward, and again, I'm going to evaluate it on its merits. But I do think that for something as important as the Trans-Pacific Partnership, I think that that's something that we should be able to vote on, and we should be able to have a vote So I'm hoping that the fast track legislation proposed will have sufficient protections to allow a vote, because we ought to be able to evaluate this deal on its merits. That's the job of Congress.
Now, I know you're not the president, and he put together this, he's backing this policy and this change, which he thinks is vital, to the future economy, and yet some traditional supporters of the Democratic Party, particularly unions, they weren't in favor of NAFTA. They're not in favor, and we saw what happened there. They're not in favor of this. So how is this articulated that this is a good deal for everyone? And that's the object of fast tracking, because some of these policies just get weighed down with so many amendments, they become obliterated.
Right.
They really don't stand behind anything.
Well, the argument that the administration is making is that opening up markets to overseas will help American companies that are trying to export their goods. It's wonderful if a company, in the 6th District can export to the rest of America or to North America, but if you can also export to China and whatnot, and China's not part of the deal, but if you can export to
Japan.
Vietnam, Japan, and whatnot, then that's going to be better for companies here at home. It will help create jobs here at home. But the problem is that if you lose those jobs overseas, if those jobs were to just move to Japan, then obviously that's not good for our economy at all, especially an economy here in New England that really counts on small businesses and counts on those jobs and has had a traditional manufacturing base. So the bottom line is, at the end of the day, it comes down to what's in the deal. And there were some things about NAFTA that weren't very good and did cause jobs to go overseas. But it's important to say this is not NAFTA. This is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So we have to evaluate TPP based on the details of the deal, not just based on what happened with NAFTA.
Can triggers be put in policies, but if it's not going the way that any one of these nations that are going to sign this treaty originally thought? Can you pull out of it? Can you pull out of a treaty? Is that something that we put? If American jobs and businesses get hurt by this deal, do we have to live by it and abide by it forever?
Well, I'm not sure, to be honest. I think that would depend on the details of the deal itself. But one of the concerns that a lot of us have is that it's one thing to have guarantees or principles about keeping jobs. It's another to actually enforce them, right? And we need to make sure that this deal doesn't only say the right things in terms of keeping jobs in America, it also provides real robust enforcement that our leaders in Washington will actually use to prosecute cases of infraction. And it's not just about keeping jobs in general, it's about making sure that the other parties to this deal follow our standards for the environment and labor standards. So labor and environmental standards are a huge part of this agreement. Now, if part of this agreement is making sure that the other countries in the Pacific Rim follow our labor and environmental standards, that's great. That's great for American businesses because we're already doing that, and that helps level the playing field. But on the other hand, if they can get away with lower labor and environmental standards, and we're held to higher ones, then that's going to push jobs overseas, and we've got to make sure we have the enforcement in place that doesn't happen.
Have you been lobbied on this by any of your constituents?
Oh yes, a
Yeah.
lot.
This is a good segue. Into,
Almost as much as this newsroom, right?
It's good for us to get an understanding of these issues. But this is a good segue into the medical device tax, because you now have become very, very supportive of repealing that. And what makes you think that your efforts now, after 5 years of Obamacare, where the Massachusetts congressional delegation has been trying, or at least bringing it to the attention of the administration, that it's not helping us. What makes you feel that this is the time that you and others will be successful right now?
Well, I think this is a place where there's more bipartisan consensus than there has been in the past. And that's what we really need to get this passed. Frankly, it's a good example of a place where the Affordable Care Act needs to be tweaked. And I'm a big supporter of the Affordable Care Act for the 3 principles that it endeavors to accomplish: reducing healthcare costs, improving healthcare outcomes, and expanding healthcare access. And so far, those things are starting. We've seen healthcare costs go down nationwide, and we've seen millions more have healthcare coverage that didn't have it before the Affordable Care Act was put into place. I think the studies are still to be, adjudicated as to whether or not healthcare outcomes have improved. But at least 2 of the 3 are already starting to be achieved. But the act is not perfect, and there are things that need to be fixed. Frankly, just like our experience here in Massachusetts, there's tremendous support for the Massachusetts healthcare program now. It polls very, very high. But that wasn't the case when it started. It has changed, but it's changed a lot. It's been modified to be a better piece of legislation over the years. The medical device tax really unfairly hits the small, innovative companies, especially startups, that are bringing new efficiencies to the marketplace. So, a good example is the company where I held a press conference on Monday in Danvers, Abiomed, and they've developed this really impressive new heart pump that helps people recover and actually helps them rejuvenate their own heart when it's inserted to people who have heart failure. Studies have shown that using this technology reduces mortality, so it literally saves lives, but it also costs less than the previous alternative, than the old technology. Abiomed is this small company in Danvers that's just beginning to produce all these devices right here, and is adding jobs in Danvers to build them. They're competing against a $3 billion European healthcare company that has the old technology, and they're trying to hold on to it. So it's a great example of how a small, local, innovative company that can really compete in the global marketplace, reduce healthcare costs, make healthcare delivery more efficient, and save lives. So we shouldn't be hitting those businesses. And the problem with this tax is it's not just 2.3%, which is sort of the headline. A company like Abiomed has to hire all these compliance people just to implement the tax. And so the actual cost of the company is higher than 2.3%.
Now, the government is actually collecting this tax. They've started collecting this tax, right?
Well, that's right. So it's actually the burden is on the companies to kind of implement it, but then yes, they send the money to the federal government, and that comes out of research and development. It comes out of the early budgets of these companies. A bigger company like Johnson & Johnson, it's not as hard to have a tax like this because frankly they already have all the compliance people and everything to implement it, and it hurts their bottom line, but they're already making huge profits already. Companies like Abiomed, it takes a long time just to get to the profit stage at all. And we don't want to cut these companies off.
But if you repeal the tax, or if you at least reduce the tax, then where would you make up that revenue? Because he's relied on that to implement the Affordable Care Act.
Well, that's a good question. So first of all, it's important to understand that this is actually a pretty small part of the overall revenue for the Affordable Care Act. So this is not like repealing this tax will throw the whole act into chaos. That's not the case. That's the first point. The second point is that, frankly, you're right. We do have to look at this balance. I sit on the budget committee as well, so I understand that it's not just about cutting taxes. We also have to make sure there are enough revenues to balance the budget. And I look forward to working with my both Republican and Democratic colleagues to see where we can make that up. Now, if the Affordable Care Act continues to be very successful at reducing healthcare costs, we may not have much to make up. And that's certainly the early trend that we've seen. But at some point, we've got to recognize that there is a balance here, and we have to find a way to strike it, because balancing the budget is another thing that we ought to be doing in Washington.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about ISIS. You've talked repeatedly about how there's a need for a political solution there as opposed to
Right.
a military solution. I'm wondering what you think that political solution looks like and how you get there, and what role the U.S. has to play in the process.
Sure. So I actually had a piece published just yesterday by Time Magazine that I wrote together with a Republican. It's a bipartisan piece, a fellow veteran. And we talked about how important it is to have a political solution to this crisis. Because we can go and deal with ISIS militarily, and we can probably be pretty successful. But if we don't leave a lasting political solution in place for these countries in the Middle East, where these political vacuums exist, where ISIS grows, then we're just going to have to send troops back there again 4 or 5 years down the road. That's what's happened in Iraq, right? We pulled out of Iraq, we pulled all our troops home, but despite the advice of Ambassador Crocker and General Petraeus saying that we needed a longer-term political solution, we didn't do that, and now we're sending American troops back there just 4 or 5 years after we left. So I think one of my responsibilities in Congress is to try to ensure that whatever we have to do to defeat ISIS today, we don't have to repeat again down the road. So there are a lot of things that need to happen in Iraq to make that possible. We've got to deal with the Kurds who feel disaffected from the government. We've got to deal with the Shia militias who are doing a lot to destabilize the entire country. And we have to make sure that the Sunnis feel included in the new government, which they clearly weren't under Prime Minister Maliki, which is what's led to this crisis today. But I think that's the key point, is to realize that we wouldn't have ISIS flourishing in Iraq if we had a stable, inclusive Iraqi government. When ISIS swept in from Syria, they didn't just defeat the Iraqi army. The Iraqi army put their weapons down and went home because they lost faith in Maliki's government. So it shows that it's fundamentally a political problem. I would have felt better if President Obama's response was to send a bunch of political advisors to Baghdad, not military advisors, as if, you know, the army just needs a few more hours of pistol time and they'll be able to defeat ISIS. I mean, that's not really realistic.
But isn't that a concern, this pivot by the Obama administration, when people like you and your bipartisan co-author have been saying this for years, generals have been saying this, that there needed to be a balanced approach to this, and yet he still seems to have be tone deaf to this, and now you've got sovereign nations in the Middle East waging war in all different parts of that region, and no one really knows what the outcome's going to be. But we do know one thing that's clear: the Sunnis are battling the Shiites, and yet you're talking about bringing them all together. Someone's going to emerge here, and it's still going to be the same old strife. So I mean, when do you, as a Democrat, it seems like no one can criticize this president for anything.
Well, I don't think that's true at all. I think if you read the piece I just wrote in Time, it's pretty clear. We disagree with some of
Why
the...
wasn't it given to the Sun as an exclusive? Well, we'll have to read it.
I can't account for that oversight. Look, I mean, I think I'm very clear, and I've been very clear many times, that I don't agree with the administration on everything we're doing, and I have some very particular foreign policy disagreements, and I think you'll see that in many of the things I've written about ISIS and how we're handling it in the Middle East. But let me come back to one of the questions that Chelsea asked too with regards to this, which, what is the U.S. role here? I went on a fact-finding mission for the Armed Services Committee to Iraq and Afghanistan, because I believe you can't really know what's going on until you see it on the ground, and you talk to the people who are trying to implement this policy, both on our side and with our allies. So we were the first congressional delegation to meet with President Ghani, the new president of Afghanistan, and I asked him this question because he talked about bringing together the Middle Eastern countries to take some leadership themselves. He said, ultimately, this has to be our problem to fix, and he's right. So I said, what can the U.S. do to help with that? And maybe the answer, and I threw this right out at him, I said, maybe the answer is the U.S. should just pull back and let you guys figure it out yourselves. And I'll tell you, he said, absolutely not. He said, whether you like it or not, the U.S. has a leadership role in the world. We don't like being the world's policeman, and we've got to make sure that we're doing everything that we can to not do that wholly ourselves. We don't like solving all the aid crises around the globe, to always be the ones that come to the rescue of people who are struck by natural disasters. But there's a certain burden of leadership, and people around the globe expect the U.S. to go first. If we're a good, strong leader, then we'll get others to come along with us. We'll get allied support. But I don't think that, unfortunately, the solution is just pulling out. I think that we require continued leadership. And the reality is that if we don't have some leadership in the Middle East, which is such a volatile part of the world, then the problems there can affect us back home. ISIS has brutally killed Americans abroad. They have also made clear their intention to kill Americans here at home. And that would be a grave mistake if we let that happen.
How do you feel about the president's nuclear deal, proposed nuclear deal with Iran, and should Congress have the ultimate sign-off on that?
Well, I think it's a step in the right direction. Now, the devil is in the details here, because we have a framework for a deal. I think a lot of people on both sides of the aisle are pleasantly surprised by how strong that framework is. But we don't have a deal yet, and we have to make sure it's a deal that not only meets the guidelines of the framework and gets signed, but it's also something that's really verifiable and we can put in put in place. And so the situation with Iran now is that they have actually acquired so much of this knowledge. I mean, frankly, we should have had something like this or even a stronger deal 10 years ago. But because we didn't 10 years ago, because previous administrations failed to do that, we're now in a situation where the Iranians have a lot of nuclear expertise that's really hard to erase. So I think the situation is a little bit different. It's not just about eliminating their nuclear infrastructure, because frankly they can rebuild that if they want to. They know how to build these advanced centrifuges now. We've got to make sure that we have incredibly intrusive inspections so that if they try to start going down that path, we can catch them right away. And I think that that's basically what this framework tries to accomplish.
Should Congress have the ultimate sign-off on that, though, as some Republicans are arguing?
Well, the reality is that many deals like this are negotiated government to government or administration to administration, and Congress doesn't have a role. That doesn't mean that Congress has no role at all or no voice in the debate, but I think that what's most important is that we get the best deal that we possibly can. You know, a lot of politicians are used to talking. But I've had to fight too, and I can tell you, talking is better than fighting. We ought to have a diplomatic deal if we can, and if you look at the alternatives to this deal, there's not a lot on the table other than war. And if we start bombing Iran, you know, we might eliminate the nuclear threat in Iran for the next few weeks, few months even, but that will only steel their resolve to build a bomb in the future, so that they don't get bombed. So I think that would be a terrible alternative. And so what's most important here is that we get a good, strong deal. And I look forward to my role in Congress and trying to make sure
Some
that
people say, though, we should just let these economic sanctions continue and just leave them.
Well, and to add something to that, I mean, this is the contradiction of Obama's framework. He himself said the sanctions didn't work because the Iranians for the last 10 years have been under sanctions, and they've been able to move this far under sanctions with their nuclear weapons program, where they're on the verge of building a nuclear bomb. So who's to say that, he's talking about snapbacks. He wants to do snapbacks on sanctions that already haven't really deterred them. It's ruined their economy, but it hasn't deterred them anyway in moving closer and closer to a nuclear bomb. So this, I think, is the thing that most people don't understand.
I actually agree with both of those statements in a way. Let me explain what I mean.
I think the Jewish state. I mean, who eliminates the threat, the grave threat that Iran has made against the Jewish state? Is that in the framework? I mean, that's another thing. I think
it absolutely is in the framework.
I didn't read it, and I haven't seen anything in any newspaper.
So let me ask you a question. It absolutely is part of the framework if the framework prevents Iran from having a nuclear weapon, because that's what they threatened to use against the state of Israel, our most important ally in the Middle East. And I'll tell you that if we go and bomb Israel, if we go and bomb with Israelis or whatever else Iran tomorrow, and set the Iranians back, but then they just have stronger resolve to build the bomb in the future, that's going to be a much graver threat to Israel than a deal that prevents them from being close to having a bomb and provides us the inspection regime to make sure that they don't make that happen. But on the sanctions, I mean, you ask a very good question, I think, about what effect have the sanctions actually have. I think that what most experts agree is that the sanctions have helped bring Iran to the table. So you're right, they have not just prevented them from continuing on their progress towards a nuclear weapon, but they have brought Iran to the table. So if we can use the sanctions to bring Iran to the table, but then use the deal to prevent them from getting a nuclear weapon, then I think that's the sweet spot where we want to be. If we just continue the sanctions, then I think you're right, they'll continue working on getting a nuclear weapon. But if we use the sanctions to force a deal, then we might be able to make some real progress. I mean, this is a very difficult situation. Don't get me wrong. This is not easy.
And no one is talking about bombing. At least no one yet in this room is talking about bombing.
And Senator Cotton was talking about it today. I mean, that is,
okay.
Senator Cotton has become one of the Republican spokesmen. Senator Cotton, who's become one of the Republican spokesmen on this issue. He is leading the Republican opposition to this deal, and he's talking about bombing today.
Well, I think this is going to Chris's point, I mean, I think it's up to Congress to mandate that these intrusive inspections that you are calling for and that are in this framework are carried out. I mean, the International Atomic Energy Commission that was supposed to be inspecting the North Korean deal in 1994, okay, that's President Clinton raved about. They were never even allowed in to check on those, the state of the ability of North Korea to continue with their program. They ended up with the nuclear bomb.
Right, well, this is
okay?
a very different deal than we have for North Korea.
This is
And
why,
that's-
you hope that these things will be put in black and white, and that they will,
Absolutely.
and that they will hold up to their end of the bargain, just
That's
like the US will hold up, and our allies will hold up to their bargain.
No, that's right. I mean, there's no question that it's not going to be a successful deal unless we can ensure compliance on both sides. But you really do have to look at the alternatives. Now, if the administration had come forward with a framework that really didn't do anything to set Iran back, then I wouldn't be optimistic about this proposal. But I think you'll see. I mean, if you've heard people on both sides of the aisle say that this is actually, this really has some chance at succeeding. And I'm not saying that it will. I mean, there's still a good chance that it could fall apart. There's a good chance that it will not be as successful as we hope. But you also have to look at the alternatives. And this is a really tough situation where the alternatives aren't very good.
Talking about both sides of the aisle for a minute, prior to the election, you said, in arguing, for your election, why would you send someone back to Congress where Congress is clearly broken? I thought that was a pretty good soundbite by you. So now you've been there 100 days. Can you just talk a little bit about just how broken is it? Or do you think things are improving a little bit? Or are they just, is Congress just mired in bipartisanship that there's no hope?
Right. Well, I think one of my surprises about Washington has been just how much of the partisanship is very institutional. So we all, freshmen, came to Washington having heard from people across the country that they're frustrated with this hyper-partisanship, that you guys ought to just work together to get things done. And we certainly heard that on the Democratic side of the aisle, and a lot of people voted against us because so many Republicans were elected this cycle, but the Republicans heard this as well. And yet, the freshman orientation, this 8-day freshman orientation, I'd say about 90% of the events were Republicans over here and Democrats over there. So you didn't even get to meet your fellow freshmen who were on the other side of the aisle. So the institution is very partisan. And so I think you have to make the effort. The reason, frankly, the reason why I was able to write this op-ed with Representative Russell of Oklahoma, a Republican, is because I invited him out to dinner. I invited him out to dinner one night. I said, look, let's develop a personal relationship, and then maybe we can find a way to work together professionally. Now, if you look at his political profile, there's a lot that we disagree with. And there are a lot of pieces of legislation that we would never be able to work on together. But when it comes to our policy with regards to ISIS in Iraq, we're both veterans of that war. We found common ground. And I think we're able to make a very strong political statement that two people from very different places on the political spectrum agree on the United States policy in this area. And I think that means a lot more than just having me with a fellow Democrat or him with another Republican.
So you selected him because he's a Iraq war vet too? So
That's part of why I was, right?
Okay.
Exactly. Yeah, and he's a very respected veteran too. He was a tremendous soldier. He's older than me. He was more senior to me in the war, but he did a tremendous job, and fellow veterans respect him a lot as well.
Just going back to Israel for a second, I applaud you for attending the President Netanyahu's speech.
Prime Minister.
Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech, and Nikki Sanders also attended. You expressed disagreement that the protocol was broken, but you
Right.
went because you said you had an obligation to listen.
Right.
Okay, now, fast forward, Netanyahu wins the election. How does the present administration repair some of the damage that has been done by both sides in this relationship, which most people feel should be a good and strong relationship?
Well, it should be a good and strong relationship, and frankly, it always has been in the past. And the fact that what Speaker Boehner did with this type of invitation and having it totally breaking the protocol really introduced a lot of, made an issue that shouldn't be partisan at all. It made it partisan. And I saw that not only in Washington, I saw it right here at home in the district, where people who never disagreed on our support for our ally Israel were suddenly at odds over what we should do, and whether there's all this pressure not just to go to the speech, there's an awful lot of pressure for me not to go to the speech. So it's really unfortunate that this has played out the way it is. Now, of course, the reality is that there are plenty of examples throughout history when allies disagree and when there are disagreements among leaders, and I think that, generally they've been resolved. I mean, we've had disagreements with our closest allies, like Great Britain, for example, and there are times when we haven't always been on the same page and people haven't gotten along. But, you remember when candidate Romney went to Great Britain and he angered the entire country over some things that he said, but that was sort of patched over. So I'm optimistic that President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu can resolve their differences, because fundamentally we're on the same page. Fundamentally, we think that Iran's acquisition of a nuclear weapon is a tremendous threat to worldwide security, not just to the security of the state of Israel, but to everybody's security. It could set off a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. And fundamentally, we agree that that Israel is our closest ally in the Middle East. They're our strongest democratic ally in that incredibly important part of the world.
But Congressman, what is a world leader? And it's not only Netanyahu. Even other world leaders have said that this administration, this president, has remained disengaged, okay, from NATO. Okay, he doesn't even see the NATO commander who came into, the Secretary General of NATO, who came into Washington for 3 days to talk to our military officials about strengthening military defenses. I mean, he doesn't meet with him. I mean, there's other...
I met with him.
Okay, but there's other...
You're not the president.
No.
And here's the other thing.
Did you stand in for the president?
I didn't.
So what are they to do if they can't get the president's ear when, President Obama likes to talk about security, okay, Israel's security. And then he's talking about my country's survival. There's a big difference there. And when he doesn't get a platform to express his needs, okay, or desires with the President of the United States, what other platform does he have?
Phil, I hear your concerns, and frankly, there are other people I hear these concerns from a lot. And I think we face an incredibly complex world, but I've been very clear. I do not agree with the president on all of these issues. And the second fact-finding mission that I went on with the Armed Services Committee was to Ukraine and to Eastern Europe, to see on the ground there what the real threat is from Vladimir Putin and what we need to do to counter it. And the Congress passed a bipartisan resolution overwhelmingly to offer more support to the Ukrainians. But the administration hasn't acted yet, and I do think the administration should take more of a leadership role. I had a very interesting conversation with the leadership in Poland. Now, Poland has the ability to supply Ukraine with some of the defensive weapons that they would like to get from us. Some of the things to counter the Russian tanks that Putin, despite everything that he says, is sending across the border to fight the Ukrainians. And we asked the Polish, if the administration doesn't act, are you willing to provide these weapons? And their response was very interesting. They said, we want to give this aid, but we need you guys to go first. Because the world looks to America for leadership. NATO looks to America for leadership. So I do think, and this is a good example in Ukraine, where my personal view is the administration needs to be stronger coming to the defense of our ally. It needs to be taking more of a leadership role.
We talked a lot today about Iran and Iraq, but you brought up Putin. How concerned should the country be about Putin? I mean, it seems that his behavior over the last several months has been nothing short of erratic. Should that where our focus be?
Well, a lot of the people who have come and testified before the Armed Services Committee in the past few months have said that at this time in our history, we have never before today have we faced such an incredibly complex set of challenges to our national security. And so, just look at some of the top three. Iran's acquisition of a nuclear weapon, ISIS and their expansion throughout the Middle East and their intention to attack us here at home, and Putin's attempt to dismantle NATO by pushing into Eastern Europe. So these are three very, very serious threats, and that's why I've taken so much time as a member of the Armed Services Committee to dive right in and to try to understand as best I can what we need to do. I mean, there's no more important decision that Congress makes than whether or not to send young Americans into harm's way, and I'm taking that responsibility very seriously. So I'll tell you, if I were to make two big conclusions, broadly speaking, from our fact-finding mission to Eastern Europe and Ukraine, it'd be this. One, Putin is a much greater threat than a lot of people realize. He really is. And I think that we would be making a mistake if we don't try to stop him now before he goes further. I think it's going to be easier to stand up to him now than if he starts to gobble up more of Eastern Europe. The second point I would make is that he and the Russians have been very adept at adapting their military to a new style of warfare. It's called hybrid warfare. It's not just about sending tens of thousands of Russian troops or thousands of Russian tanks into Western Europe. That's kind of the Cold War mentality. It's about a huge propaganda machine. It's cyber warfare. They've been using cyber warfare against Lithuania and Poland. They use it against the White House, according to CNN today. It's about partisans and special forces. It's about changing the opinions of local populations and undermining the local government. So we have to be able to meet that threat. And I think, frankly, our response to date, I mean, this is one of the things I saw when you go and see. We literally we flew out to training bases in Poland and Lithuania and saw what kind of training our troops were doing with our allies. And look, there are great troops out there doing great things, and the allies feel a lot of reassurance that we're there. But the training is very conventional. We're still sending tanks, into these Eastern European countries to just sort of face off against the Russians, when the Russians are busy just, changing people's opinions. So I think we have to
Maybe they
adapt.
have to explain.
Maybe they should work for Boston 2024.
Speaking of which, do you have an opinion on that?
I do. I think that Boston 2024, I mean, first of all, I support the idea of putting it to a referendum and letting the people decide. But my personal view is that it can be a great thing for the state. But it's a great thing for the state if it really helps launch us on some of the transformative investments and infrastructure improvements that we need to make. So if you can use 2024 as a vehicle to help fix the T, really get our transportation system back on track, help make some good investments like the investments they propose in the UMass campus, then that'll be a very good thing. But there's a little bit of a disconnect between Olympics that's being sold as an Olympics on the cheap and an Olympics that people envision as something that can really be transformative for the state. If you look at what London did, I think it's a great model. And London has made tremendous transportation improvements. And London has a big transportation project right now called Crossrail, which is trying to connect some of the different train stations across London where currently you can't connect. Sound familiar? North and South Station, right? And that's something we've needed for decades in Boston. Now, Crossrail wasn't finished in time for the Olympics in London. But I think the Olympics were still sort of part of the impetus that made it happen. And if we can use that, the Boston 2024 Olympics in the same way, we might look back on it 100 years from now and say this was a truly transformative event for Boston. But if we can't do that, then I think we'll really miss the opportunity.
Is there a tradition in Congress where a longer-serving member, either from your party or maybe even a Republican, takes a freshman kind of under their wing and kind of shows them the ropes and places to go, places to avoid? And if so, has anyone done that with you?
Actually, the Massachusetts delegation has been tremendously helpful in this regard. And I mean, there's not a single person in the delegation who hasn't been helpful. Both senators, all the other representatives. Just as some examples, I think Richie Neal is the dean of the delegation. And Representative Neal really got everyone rallied behind me as soon as I won the primary and has been tremendously helpful. And he is just such a wise man who we can call anytime for advice. How do I handle this tricky situation or whatnot? Representative Joe Kennedy is someone who he's just 2 years ahead of me in this process. He was just a freshman himself, and so he's a great person to talk to about all the challenges of just putting together a new office and getting up to speed. He's been tremendously helpful. I text him all the time and say, hey, what do we do about this situation? And he's very responsive. Representative Nikki Songus, we served together on the Armed Services Committee. In fact, she helped me get on that committee. And so we're going to be great partners in serving together on that committee and making sure that we can do good work for this part of the state. So she's been very helpful as well. Representative McGovern, he was actually assigned to be my mentor, so just before he even got to swearing in, he was that guy who kind of took me under his wing and helped me navigate some of the early political challenges. We had a very active political season in the Democratic Party, choosing party leaders and whatnot for ranking members of key committees. There was this big battle over who would be the ranking member of the Energy and Commerce Committee. And that was a political situation I didn't really know anything about, having no political background myself, and Representative McGovern helped me understand that. So the whole delegation has really been tremendously helpful.
You know, we focused a lot on foreign policy, and we could talk about that all day, but yesterday, you were on the budgetary committee, and yesterday Rand Paul announced his, presidential campaign, where he almost came off as, Reagan-esque, talking about building up the military strength, so you don't have to go to war, you're strong enough in places. And there have been some studies or reports now that we have to replenish our weaponry, but smart weaponry, not to go back to these old traditional models,
Like tanks.
that the bureaucrats want and the military leaders don't, is that something that you look serving in the military and feeling that way? I know President Obama has put in more money in this budget for the military, for some of those things, but isn't that probably a good way to start looking at this approach? We've gotten away from that approach, and plus, I imagine that most of our weaponry has got to be worn down or at least outdated after all the fighting we've done. It needs to be, well, at least we need new weaponry.
Well, it's a great question, because I think that there's a strong bipartisan consensus on the Armed Services Committee that sequestration has been very, very bad and even dangerous for the national security of the United States. And it's not just defense sequestration. It's the fact that we're not investing in basic scientific research, which ensures we have a technological edge over our adversaries. It's not investing in education, which is fundamental to maintain that edge. So sequestration across the board is a terrible thing, and everybody on the Armed Services Committee knows that and wants to get rid of it. And there's this very interesting dialogue between the Armed Services Committee and the Budget Committee about how to make that happen. So it's been a very interesting place to sit. Very important, discussion, debate that's going on in Washington right now. But you also bring up a very good point about modernizing our military. And one of the problems in Congress is that a lot of times, members of Congress hold on to old weapon systems just because they bring the bacon home to the district.
Don't work.
Right?
Yeah.
Well, Congress right now is ordering the production of more tanks than the Army has even ordered.
Because some
bacon
chairman
to the
is in the district
Right.
making tanks, right?
So when the Secretary of Defense came before the committee, I asked a question that probably annoyed a lot of my colleagues, but I said to him, Mr. Secretary, can you give me a list of your top 5 weapon systems that you want, weapon systems or programs that you want to cut, but we here in Congress won't let you for political reasons? And
You asked that question?
I asked that question, and you know what his answer was?
Good for you.
He said, I can't give you a list of 5, but I'll give you a list of 20. And he's going to give it to us. So we haven't received it yet, but we're following up with his office and we're going to get it. And those are the kind of tough decisions that we need to be willing to make as a Congress to ensure that we not only have a strong defense, but that we have a modern defense. And we have an efficient defense, because money that we're wasting in the Department of Defense is money that we can't be spending on education, or money that we can't be investing in transportation like the T. So we have a responsibility on the Armed Services Committee not only to make sure that we have a strong defense, but that we have a modern defense and that we spend those defense dollars wisely.
Has BRAC come up at all? Were they going to re-implement that at all?
It hasn't come up yet. I've heard a couple of mentions of it, but it hasn't been before the committee.
Okay. We're down to the last few minutes. Anyone else have
Good.
no question? So what do the next 100 days, what's the focus?
Well, we now have almost all of our team assembled. We're still hiring some of our economic development team. Economic development is one of my priorities for the district. Bringing good paying jobs to the 6th is something that's on the minds of everybody. And I made a conscious decision to actually reduce the size of my Washington staff a little bit in order to make room for an economic development team here in the district. But we're still trying to hire that team, put that together. So we still have a little bit of hiring to finish to make sure that we have the best team we possibly can. But now we're gonna move into a phase of not just listening, but starting to do things. We've had some good wins. We had a big win with the Gloucester fishermen in getting NOAA to change their regulations, which apparently is pretty unprecedented. We had a big win with FEMA and the disaster aid, working closely with the governor and the other members of the delegation, because Essex County, which is a big part of the district, was initially left out of the disaster aid proposal, and now it's back in. We've had some great successes with constituent services and just taking care of people in the district who aren't getting the support they need from the Social Security Administration or the Veterans Administration or whatnot, especially the VA. They're very difficult to work with, but we're actually bringing on someone who's just starting in a week to work exclusively on veterans cases, because there are so many, and he's a fellow veteran. He's incredibly talented. We're very fortunate to have him. He'll be starting working in a week. He's actually not from the district, but he worked, but he was in the Marines, and he's a fantastic guy. So
Economic development team, that's
Right.
certainly thinking out of the box. And does anybody else have, I mean, you're giving up a staff or a couple to do this. So what is gonna be that mission for this economic development team?
So their mission is to act, the way I view the role of our office is, we've got some nice ideas and whatnot, but the best ideas are gonna come from the community. So I'm not coming in and just saying that, hey, we're gonna do everything ourselves and we're gonna have all the good ideas, but we're gonna work to be a convener, to get the right people in the room. For example, earlier this week I met with the delegation from Lynn, the political delegation from Lynn, the state reps and senators. And we talked about some of the things that we need to do to make Lynn an attractive place for businesses to move to. Because if we can revitalize Lynn, it will be good for the entire district. Because it's Lynn is right between Boston and the rest of the district, right? And I talked to 2 different CEOs in the past few weeks about the potential to move their companies here to Lynn. One of them is a CEO of a food company. And there are a lot of food companies in Lynn, so I was making the case to her that there are other companies that have found success here. It's very close to Boston. It's got great access to other communities where people like to live. And there are a lot of things that are advantageous about it. But I didn't have a business case to put to her. I didn't have a 10-page proposal that could say, here are some of the tax incentives you might make, and here are some other CEOs of companies you can talk to, and here are the other businesses that do business like you do. So I'm working with the Lynn delegation to put that together. So that's just a small example of the kind of work that our economic development team can do to make sure that we don't just have good ideas, but that we actually get them implemented for the district.
Sounds good. Don't forget about Tewksbury, Wilmington, Bedford.
I absolutely won't, and I've been out here. We've had
You talked about Lynn in the campaign too.
Yeah.
I did, and I use Lynn as an example. It's one of 39 cities and towns in the district. It's only one of 39 in a sense, and yet it does have a very important role, and I think it can be a model for some of the development that can occur at other places. Frankly, the way Lowell has been, that's another thing I talk about, is how Lowell in many ways, it could be a model for Lynn.
I think the Port Lowell Pub should
Absolutely.
put a franchise right here in downtown Lowell. It was one of my favorite places when I lived
I'd
there.
rather have a Maddie's.
Well, Congressman Moulton, well, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and ideas with us in your first 100 days in Congress. We appreciate you coming today. Wish you the best, and hopefully we'll see you in another quarter.
Thank you very much for having me back.
Thank you.